Ladies and gentlemen, thank you all for being here. Not at least, thank you, Professor Font, for your kind words of welcome, and organizers, of course, for the opportunity to present my paper, this splendid place, so-called one of the eminent places of Central European memory. I would like to start with a remark that in medieval Central Europe, around 1000, except for the Ottonians, or except for the Holy Roman Empire ruled by the Ottonians, power was concentrated in the hands of three ducal families: the Přemyslid in Bohemia, the Piasts in Poland, and the Árpáds in Hungary. It works. These families had become the leaders in a relatively short period of time, between the middle of the 9th and the middle of the 10th centuries, with small overlaps on both sides. The rulers of medieval Central Europe also had in common that they could not benefit from the legacy of late antiquity, and they had built their power and social position under the pressure of the Carolingian, later Holy Roman Empire. So let us ask, how had they defined themselves against the powerful Western neighbor? And how had they persuaded the home clan leaders to have themselves represented? Had they seized the public space by force, or was the new order based on a charismatic treaty that kept the balance between the dukes and nobles or elders? What were the rights and duties of the dukes? What did they demand from their tribes, nations, gentes, and what did they offer them? Before attempting to answer these questions, it is important to note that the changes in Central Europe around the year 1000 can be traced mainly from sources originating in the West, which were interested in its eastern neighbors only when events had some bearing on the empire or West in common. But Daniel spoke about this problem of Central European medievistic. It is therefore natural that the sources only captured fragments that may offer a misleading picture of the conditions at the time. So, as you can see, this is a map, Central Europe around 1000. Here are Přemyslid, Árpád, and Piast Holy Roman Empire. It should be also mentioned that Central Europe grew out of the ruins of the Carolingian world. In the early 10th century, Carolingian border counts disappeared from the public space, with their place being taken by local leaders, and the eastern periphery of the Frankish world changed as well. Whereas the Bavarians, after the loss of Pannonia and the Eastern Mark, had to withdraw beyond the old imperial borders on the Enns River and face the raids of Magyars, the Saxons neighbored the Obodrids, Veleti, and Sorbian tribes. The opportunity for invasions had already been seized by the Duke Otto the Illustrious, which would place power rise of the Saxons before 912, when the Sorbian asked the Magyars for help. Yes, Enns River is around here. Sorbians are here, Veleti tribes and Obodrids tribe, later Veleti changed to Lutici. According to the chronicler Widukind of Corvey, the Magyar protection was quite costly and exhausted the Sorbian, but they had been spared looting for 2 decades because the Saxons probably did not return to the Slavic Elbe region until the end of 928. Under the leadership of the King Henry the Flower, they conquered Brandenburg and occupied its wide surrounding Omnium Regionem. In the spring of 929, King Henry seized the Sorbian fortress Gena, and he completed the successful campaign before Prague, where the Duke of the Czechs Wenceslaus surrendered to him in deditionem accepit. Widukind of Corvey states that Henry made the neighboring tribes of the Obodrids, Veleti, Sorbian, and Czechs pay tributes to him, which is, however, inaccurate. His words can only apply to the Czechs because the tribute, which had been paid to Bavaria from more than a century, was delivered to Saxony from 929. From the Duke Wenceslaus, Henry requested an oath of vassalage, which was, in the summer of 950, publicly taken by Wenceslaus' brother and successor Bolesław as well. Somewhere in Bohemia, in a place called Newcastle, Novum Castrum, probably Vyšehrad, close to Prague Castle, he stood before the King Otto under the banners. He listened to the king and answered his questions, after which he was pardoned and released. So far, Widukind of Corvey. Bolesław allegedly remained loyal and useful to the king, fidelis et utilis, until the end of his life. Widukind of Corvey could thus appreciate the presence of Czech reinforcements in the Battle of Lechweld in 955 as well as the tribute and visits to court diets. The commitments of his ancestors were also honored by Bolesław's son, Bolesław II, who represented the Czechs at the diet in Quedlinburg in 973. 10 years later, visited the court diet in Quedlinburg not only Duke of the Czechs, Bolesław, but also the Duke of the Obodrids, Mstivoj. Had they been brought together by similar interests or social status? In the oaths of allegiance, juramenta, the Obodrid dukes were certainly a match for the Czech Přemyslids. On the Saxon soil, however, the Obodrids had the reputation of an ancient enemies. The aversion was evidently mutual, because Widukind mentions that at his time, perhaps in 939, the Obodrids killed the Duke of Saxony. Cross-border disputes continued until October 955, when the Obodrid Duke Stojnev suffered a defeat and his brother Nakon asked the Saxon for a truce. According to Danish tradition, there was a lasting peace under the Nakon, and the Slavs paid the tribute, sclavi sub tributo servierunt. Therefore, it may be assumed that the King Otto pardoned Nakon, albeit at a high price, because the Obodrids probably had to surrender North Albingia, which had been given to them by Charlemagne in 804.
North Albingia is this part of Northern Europe.
The old order established under Charlemagne collapsed not only in the north. In 929, the Saxons crossed the limits Sorabicus on the Saale River and fortified themselves in Meissen, thus claiming the lands between the Elbe, Saale and other rivers. Saxon pressure continued in the years to come, and where violence was not enough, bribes helped. Brandenburg was exchanged by the Duke Tugomir for Saxon oaths and money, and all Slavs as far as the Oder River submitted themselves to the royal collectors, tributis regalibus, and not only tithes. As the Bishop Thietmar cited later, the Saxons occupied the most fertile fields And when the Slavs became indebted, they were banished or sold into slavery, and their land was divided among Saxon colonists. The penetration of the Saxons into the Slavic Elbe region was accompanied by the murder of the Slavic elites. The Margrave Gero, who represented the king by the Sorbian, eliminated at a banquet as many as 30 Slavic leaders, drunken with wine. Also the story, unknown from anywhere else, has been declared implausible with reference to the crucial role of the nobles in the collection of tithes. It should be remembered that the Saxons did not need the local lords because they considered the occupied territories beyond the Elbe and Saale rivers part of their duchy.
Which means
the Emperor Otto approved of the hard approach. In January 968, he sent a letter to the Saxons that the rebelling Slavs had no right to proper treatment. It is thus no wonder that the tribute collection and the enforcement of various obligations were accompanied by raids, and that the obodrites and the veleti were able to put aside mutual distrust, and in the uprising of 983 they conquered Brandenburg and Havelberg and pushed the Saxons back beyond western bank of the Elbe River. The rebels were not joined by the Sorbian Slavs, perhaps because the Margrave Gero deprived them of family leaders, elders. From the relatively quiet Sorbian background, the Saxons began to remove east curiously. Around 963, Gero clashed with the Duke Mieszko, who then ruled the Lesko family, Sclavi, qui dicuntur Licicavici, and should be a friend of the Emperor Otto. At Easter 973, Mieszko arrived at a diet in Quedlinburg, which would imply that friendship meant vassalage, perhaps even tributes, which was, however, not mentioned until later, namely by Thietmar of Merseburg. The Bishop of Merseburg confided in parchment at a time when the Holy Roman Emperor Henry was embroiled in wars with Mieszko's son, the Duke of the Poles, Bolesław the Brave. Therefore, in his chronicle, he contrasted the idolized Mieszko with the apostate Bolesław. Whereas Mieszko allegedly did not dare to enter the house of the Margrave Hodo wearing a fur coat, Bolesław supposedly forgot about good manners because the Emperor Otto III had made him a lord, quod tributarium faciens dominum. Good manners were associated by Thietmar with loyalty, fidelitas, and the tribute which Mieszko paid, probably, for the possessions as far as the Varta River. It is indisputable that Mieszko was Otto's vassal, like the dukes of the Czechs and the Obodrites. At the court diet in Quedlinburg in 984, after the death of the Emperor Otto II, he took an oath of allegiance, juramentum, to the Duke of Bavaria Henry. The next year, however, he went over to the side of the King Otto III, was rewarded by him, and for 2 years he supported the Saxon campaigns against the rebellious Slavs, Elbe Slavs. The duties of a royal vassal were apparently recognized also by Bolesław the Brave, who in the summer of 1002 set out for Merseburg to pay homage to the Holy Roman King Henry II. However, Bolesław was ambushed, which started a war lasting till 1018. The struggle was interrupted by the peace agreement of 1004, which was considered bad in Saxony, and later was peace brought by the spectacular reconciliation in 1013, when the Duke of the Poles renewed his oath of allegiance and walked in front of the King Henry as his sword bearer and cipher after Mass. A common language was found as late as in 1018 under conditions that Thietmar of Merseburg found degrading for the empire. The position of Thietmar is understandable because the peace that was concluded in 1018 granted the Duke of the Poles extensive privileges. Nonetheless, Bolesław the Brave did not think of independence in the full sense of the word. He merely traded imperial universalism for papal protection, which had been negotiated for the Piast possessions by the Duke Mieszko. Perhaps with the Pope's blessing, definitely to the sincere indignation of imperial chroniclers, he received the royal anointing, the symbolically equaling Holy Roman rulers in 1025. The condemnation by the empire sources contradicts the understanding that accompanied the coronation of the king of the Hungarians, Stephen, at the end of 1000. Thietmar of Merseburg directly emphasized that this had happened by the grace of the Emperor Otto III, Imperatoris Gratia et Ortatum. Also, for good measure, he added that Stephen was the brother-in-law of the Duke of Bavaria from 1002, the Holy Roman King Henry. Yet no matter if Stephen demanded Otto's approval or he contended himself with the Pope's word, it is evident that the Magyars, more precisely the ruling elites, had received baptism already at the end of the 10th century, but at the same time, no one considered returning to the situation of the Carolingian period, of the Carolingian age, when Pannonia was subordinated to the Bishop of Bavaria, more precisely Bishop Passau and Archbishop of Salzburg. It was probably enough for the Ottonian to be able to welcome the envoys of the Grand Prince Geza in Quedlinburg at Easter 973. The integration of the central Danubian region into the structures of the Ottonian Holy Roman Empire may have been related to the transformation of East Francia. After collapse of the Carolingian power structures, it was impossible for Ottonian dynasty to control the public space through representatives, missi, and delegated powers. From the beginning, they could only rely on hereditary family possessions in Saxony, from which they negotiated with the land leaders who defended the local interests of the Franconians, Suebi, Bavarians, and Lotharingians. Via facti, Henry the Fowler and all his successors shared power with 4 dukes after the handover of Saxony to the Billungs with at least 5. The restored Eastern Mark, incorporated in imperial structures, would, together with Pannonia, increase the weight of the Bavarian vote, which the Ottonian did not want, and, as rulers of the disparate union of 5 tribes, which means Holy Roman Empire, could not even allow. Strong opposition was encountered mainly by Henry the Fowler. He attempted to reverse the balance of forces by the military administrative reforms of the Duchy of Saxony, so-called Burgwart organization, and the invasions to the east, beyond the Elbe and Saale rivers. He achieved considerable success in 929, as I have mentioned already. when he conquered the Sorbian Elbe region and imposed the tribute and the oath of allegiance on the Duke of the Czechs. At that time, the east of the empire split into two parts, whereas the Czechs and to some extent the Polabian Obodrids defended the validity of the old obligations, and their relation to the Holy Roman kings continued to be defined by vassalage and tributes. The Sorbs and the Veleti were subordinate to the Saxons, who took the best land and enforced taxes, services, and other duties on the Slavs. In the lower Elbe region, the hatred for everything Saxon grew into a rebellion in 983. The established union of the Lutici restored the collective search for justice and defined its identity on the negation of the Saxon order and customs. A more accommodating approach to the West was taken by the Piasts. Nevertheless, after brief experience with tribute and vassalage, they decided that they couldn't be their own masters. The Holy Roman Empire also inspired the Árpáds, who, however, did not cease to pay attention to the Byzantine Empire and thus stretched between the Latin and Greek words. Various ways of public communication with the imperial elites divided the area around the eastern edge of the Holy Roman Empire into outer and inner peripheries. They both mimicked the Western patterns of ritual and symbolic action. However, the imperial events involved only the communities of the inner periphery, the Obodrids, Veleti, Sorbs, and Czechs, whose identity was derived from services of personal nature, vassalage, and tribute payment. Nevertheless, the union of the Veleti disintegrated. The Sorbs were subordinated to the counts of Saxony, and the Obodrids did not recover from the defeat suffered in 955 and retained their influence only on a local scale. The changes of the 10th century were thus best coped by the Czechs, not only why I'm Czech. The protection by the Bavarians was replaced by the Saxon, and the tribute was complemented by vassalage. But the scope of the duties did not change, more precisely till 1002, when Duke Vladivoj sought out the King Henry II, pledged allegiance to him, and was entrusted with the administration of Bohemia by him. What the Duke of the Czechs consented to and what he received was described by Thietmar of Merseburg, who used the phrase in beneficium acquisit. Literally translated, Vladivoj was given Bohemia in fief. It should be mentioned that feudal law did not begin to penetrate into imperial East until the 12th century. In the context of 1002, it would appropriate to consider a spatial oath of a personal nature that legitimized the duke's status in the public space in Bohemia. In general, the transformation of the community of the Czechs into a duchy with the primacy of the Přemyslids can be regarded as an example of the fact that the dialogue of domestic preconditions with the West could have been constitutive. Also, the meaning of the year 1000 was discovered in Western only retrospectively. Its importance for medieval Central Europe is indisputable. Not because Otto III, perhaps in agreement with Pope Sylvester II, acknowledged the right of the Hungarians to the crown, or because he gave his consent to the elevation of Gniezno to the seat of the archbishop, but because the emperor, whose job it was to defend the principles of imperial universalism, took note of the fact that Hungarians and Poles did not desire vassalage, but good neighborhood. As you can see on this map, this is a church administration around 1100. And you can see that most of the bishoprics here were founded around 1000, shortly before or shortly after, which shows the importance of Millennium for central medieval Europe. Not that Otto's successors would not have attempted to return to the traditional arrangement. Henry of Bavaria tried to bring Bolesław the Brave to senses, and Conrad II spent years fighting with the king of the Hungarian Stephen. The superiority on the battlefield, however, was always enough only for short-lived promises. Out of necessity, the imperial court had to come to terms with occasional commitments of personal nature. Also, the hereditary possessions of the Árpáds and Piasts were subjected to many trials in the first half of the 11th century. Proud individuality became one of the distinctive features of medieval Central Europe. The Árpáds and Piasts symbolically endowed medieval Central Europe with an outlook of the context. Whereas the word of the Czech Přemyslid basically ended in Regensburg, later in Magdeburg. The Piasts were in contact with the Vikings and Varygians in the Baltic region and the Ruriki dukes in the east. After the conquest of Kiev, Bolesław the Brave made far-reaching plans for an alliance with the Byzantine emperor. The horizon of Árpáds can be considered extraordinary because their kingdom filled the space on the border of two great cultures, Latin and Greek. The emperor could perceive the semi-dependent or independent monarchies in the eastern outposts of the Holy Roman Empire as unsuitable. Nevertheless, since he himself ruled only a free union of tribes or nations that observed their own traditions, he accepted the more or less symbolic role of a mediator or arbitrator. Ottonian renovation in the 10th century brought little joy to the Polabian Slavs as well. Between the Saale, Elbe and other rivers, Saxon influences blended with Czech and Polish ones. On the lower Elbe, the Obodry dukes still resisted the pressure of the Saxon and the Danes. And the rest of the land belonged to the Lutici, who renounced the dukes as well as the Christian faith. The Lutician Federation disintegrated in 1057, but it had already been evident earlier that the value structures of medieval Central Europe would be shaped by others, in particular Hungarian Árpáds, Polish Piasts, and the Czech Přemyslids. In the long shadow of the Holy Roman Empire, their complex dialogue produced a space chained to the West, but mentally independent. Thank you for your attention.
Probably a short question. I have. You did, yes. To Professor Wihoda, you didn't mention Moravia question. That is also that with Cyril-Methodian. I know there is a big question, but when this big picture also we must find some place for this Cyril-Methodian mission in this map. If you, no, sorry for the question, but probably in your book there is, but for the company.
Thank you very much for your question. Of course, this question is of great importance, but not for the 10th century. is very important for the 9th century. We need to ask which role or which mission was connected with Kirill and Methodius. It was not the Christianization, it was not the faith, Christian faith. It was the organizing of first bishoprics in Central Europe, not in Central Europe, in outside of the old borders of the antique Roman Empire. And as you can see, this is the conclusion. It was an archbishopship at the end for 5 years. Methodius had this title, very nice title, Archbishop of the Holy Moravian Church, but it was so far as nothing. Yeah? He had only one bishop, Latin bishop, in Nitra. And the tradition was so weak that in Hungary it was not possible to continue this ecclesiastical tradition in the 10th or 11th century because of this. And in Moravia it was very complicated because it seems, at least to me, that this Archbishop Moravia was destroyed, and the heritage or the successors, it was the bishop's seat in Olomouc, renewed in the 10th century and definitely in 1063. Yeah. This legacy, it's also a big question. Yeah, this legacy is very important, but not for Central Europe. It was only the secondary role, cultural, at least in Czech lands, Bohemia and Moravia. But this legacy was very important on Balkan and for the Eastern Slavs, but not for Middle Europe. Because the pressure of the Latin literature and intelligence was so hard that it was only partially or local, so local, like for example Sazava monastery in Bohemia. In Hungary it was a little more, but it was not so strong to influence the whole Hungarian society. Yeah, because the society was Latin oriented. And the third question, it is this, Daniel spoke about this expansion of Bolesław the Brave to the south, Moravia and Bohemia. In the Czech literature, the traditional view was defined, it was an occupation, Polish occupation, yeah? But it is gone. Yeah? Now, the sources are clear in this question. Moravians were allies of Bolesław Chrobry. Not the same value, but allies. And also, Bolesław Chrobry was not a dictator in Bohemia, because he was elected at Prague Castle. And Prague Castle is the main political point for the Czechs, for the Bohemians. So, and which means Bolesław Chrobry was legitimized to this election, and he was official ruler of the Czechs. But you know, history is writing per the yeah, they won, and so in this context, later in the Czech tradition, by Cosmas of Prague, of course, Bolesław Chrobry was accused as a tyrant, and so I'm sorry, my answer was much longer and much broader, but this question is so very important for the 9th century, but not for the 10th century.